Welcome to session 2, where we discuss Berry Gordy and the Motown sound coming out of Detroit in the early 60s. And the title here is The Sounds of Assimilation. So we want to talk about the issue of assimilation, the sort of civil rights theory, if you will, or really a national theory of assimilation and what that means in this stage of the civil rights movement, and how that sort of comes to be viewed as suspect, as perhaps not as great as it sounds. So we have the dilemma of the melting pot. The United States was founded as a nation of immigrants, originally colonists, who largely supplanted the native population, the Native Americans, and created a society purportedly based on shared ideals rather than a shared heritage, right? The idea is that people were coming together for the new in the U.S., what would become the U.S. in the Americas, rather than being beholden to old ways of thinking. Of course, to a great extent, this is misleading. Those shared ideals mainly stemmed from the European Enlightenment and those values. And the great majority of the colonists came from Great Britain, and therefore they held a shared heritage. What they were trying to get away from was religious persecution and really the lack of land, right? The fact that there just wasn't enough land. Yet from the beginning, there were immigrants from other areas than just Great Britain, primarily Germany, France, the Netherlands. Early on in the nation's history, the notion of the assimilation of immigrants into an ideal society, a city upon a hill, played a major role in what becomes the U.S. and U.S. policies. John Hector St. Jean de Crevecoeur, in his Letters from an American Farmer of 1782, writes, quote, "What then is the American, this new man? He is one who is leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the government he obeys, and the rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted," notice that word, melted, "into a new race of men, whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world," end quote. So the U.S. citizen, the American as he calls it, regardless of his or her origin, becomes a new person holding new ideals, owing to the fact that he or she embraces a new mode of life, the U.S. government, and a new rank, the status of being an American. This emphasis on the new and the renewed, the transformation of the old world order into a new world order, if you wish, is a bid for modernism. That the importance here is to be new, not to rely upon traditions. It's like, there was that famous argument between John Cage, the American avant-garde composer, and I forget who the interlocutor was, but the person from Europe says, "I don't see how you can compose considering you're so cut off from all tradition." And John Cage says, "I don't see how you can compose when you're so close to all tradition." So the ideal of the American is to be new, to be modern, to leave behind traditions, to forge a new identity. So the central element of the American myth, and you can see that what Crevecoeur is concerned with here is a mythologization. A central element of that myth is the image of the U.S. as a self-created nation, not based on tradition, but rather on a rational approach to freedom and the formation of a society of individuals. The result of the process of assimilation of immigrants came to be referred to as the melting pot. This comes from a play by Israel Zangwill of 1901. Now, the Ford English School, so remember Ford automobile production, and we're going to talk about the importance of Ford in a moment. He established an English school in 1914, and what he did is he literalized the metaphor of the melting pot by having the students that are coming from various countries that are speaking other languages. They learned English at the school, and at their graduation ceremony, they come onto the stage dressed in clothes from their country of origin. So let's say they're from Germany, they wear the lederhosen, the shorts with the suspenders and all that, and the hat with the little feather on it. This sort of traditional, but really in some ways stereotypical garb. They come in wearing that, and then they pass through a giant melting pot, and they come out the other end dressed in suits and waving an American flag. So literalizing this metaphor of the melting pot. The metaphor typically applied to the integration of European white immigrants into U.S. society. By the 1920s, the U.S. became increasingly vigilant over the issue of immigration and passed a series of laws that employed quotas to restrict immigration from certain areas, including Italy, Poland, and Russia, because in the 1880s there was an explosion of immigration from these areas. So in the 1920s they start to clamp down. While they promote immigration, the laws promote immigration from Britain, Ireland, and Germany, populations that had successfully integrated previously, right? The Irish were controversial before, but by the 1920s they're considered more attractive elements in that sense. Now, non-white populations, particularly the Chinese, created problems for the ideal of integration. Laws dating back to the 1880s sought to exclude Chinese immigration, and many immigrants were confined to relatively circumscribed areas within cities, known even today as Chinatowns, where denizens maintained traditional modes of life, or at least sometimes did, languages, and made little attempt to assimilate. So, still today in New York, you can find some, not as many anymore, but you can find some enclaves in Chinatown where they really don't speak very much English at all, right? There's no attempt to assimilate into the wider culture, and that has to do with Chinese prejudice in this country, or anti-Chinese prejudice that goes back to really some of the early days of the country, with the establishment of the railroads, for which a great deal of Chinese labor was used in the West. Of course, assimilation at first did not apply to blacks. Originally slaves, and therefore non-citizens, blacks were considered by white society undesirable and unassimilable. Like the Chinese, blacks were considered by many whites to be too racially different and inferior to integrate properly into U.S. society even after emancipation. Unlike the Chinese, for the most part, blacks were not immigrants at all in the normally accepted sense, because they were here already, but as slaves. They were brought to North America as property. They had roots in the U.S. that were historically coeval with the earliest colonists, and yet were always considered a people apart from the greater U.S. social fabric. However, the abolitionists, black activists, and the reconstituted U.S. government following the Civil War sought, in part through the Reconstruction of the South, to integrate blacks more equitably. In this manner, the metaphor of the melting pot and the theory of integration and assimilation was applied to the pursuit of civil rights by and on behalf of blacks in the U.S. And this is an important moment, of course. The direction of assimilation, though, is always understood to be the gradual accommodation of the blacks to white society, or of the Germans, or of the Irish, or of the Chinese, where assimilation is thought to be open to the Chinese. So it's always the accommodation of these other groups to the way things are done in white society in the U.S., and therefore the gradual suppression of marked black or othered characteristics in preference to white normative values, behaviors, and cultural assumptions. The idea of assimilation is always unidirectional, right? It might sound like what you mean when you say assimilate is you just come together and sort of work everything out, but what it really means, at least in political terms, is that the culturally other group, whether that's blacks or like I said, European immigrants or Eastern European immigrants or Chinese, the idea is for them to become more like normative white society, right? And normative here really has a kind of regulative role. The normative is that which is generally accepted as how one does things without being stated as such, and yet it has a sort of rule-like characteristic. So assimilation remains the dominant paradigm for understanding the goals of racial accommodation through the first half of the 20th century, while certain scholars, like John Dewey in the 40s, promoted the notion of cultural pluralism, which will become very popular later, the ideal of a heterogeneous range of values and cultures as opposed to the homogeneous culture proffered by the melting pot metaphor. The majority of scholars and political figures touted the ideal of assimilation as a means for racial uplift and social harmony. The uplift here is, of course, the idea that blacks become more like whites, in essence, that they become integrated into U.S. society. Major political gains for the view of assimilation were achieved through the legal defeat of school segregation in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. This is, of course, one of the major pieces of legislation in our nation's history, in the U.S. history. And what it does is it ends de jure legal segregation, right? So the idea is that the schools are meant to be integrated, that there can't be a separate but equal. That decision dismantles the supposition of separate but equal spaces and services for blacks and whites. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., particularly in his early rise to fame following the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 through 56, he espoused a quasi-utopian vision of integration and assimilation. The efforts toward desegregation and integration culminated, at least by rule of law, in two important pieces of legislation in the mid-60s pushed by Lyndon B. Johnson, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, and we'll talk about them in greater detail later. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech is considered by many to be one of the most famous and most influential speeches in support of assimilation. But by 1963, there were already cracks emerging within the facade of the melting pot with respect to racial integration. King's I Have a Dream speech, delivered August 28th of 1963 during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and we're going to talk about the March on Washington in several sessions in this class. It's often cited as an emblem of the ideal of assimilation and integration. He says famously, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers." End quote. However, on April 16th of that same year, Martin Luther King Jr. penned an open letter known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, expressing his pessimism regarding white acceptance of racial integration and the need for nonviolent protest as opposed to pursuing civil rights exclusively through the courts and legislation. Let's take a look at an excerpt from that letter. "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Counselor," which was a racist group, or the Ku Klux Klanner, another racist group, of course, but the white moderate, who is devoted more to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. So notice this. This is an important letter, right? He sounds here much more like Marcus Garvey than he sounds in any of his previous writings, right? Marcus Garvey said something very similar, that he kind of thinks that in some ways the Ku Klux Klanner is a greater friend to African Americans because at least he or she is honest and says, "I hate you." Whereas the white moderate says, "No, I love you," but then acts as though he or she hates you by not doing anything to help, by just getting in your way, becoming an impediment, but all the time saying, "Oh, no, your time is coming, your time is coming. Equality is coming." This is a level of pessimism that you don't usually see in the writings of Martin Luther King Jr., and I think it shows a very important pivot that's happening around 63, 64 in the civil rights movement, where assimilation is becoming questioned. Now, that doesn't mean that it goes away, as we'll see. I mean, most of the music that we're about to talk about happens from 62 throughout the rest of the 60s. So the paradigm of assimilation is still very much a part of things, right? Especially in the sort of official program of mass-produced music and mass-produced culture. Now, Detroit plays a huge role in this, because in the 2 decades after World War II, Detroit was the center of major automobile production and also heightened racial tension, but also heightened racial opportunity. So Detroit is this very kind of conflicted area. It's a contextual space, if you will. or contested space. In the summer of 1943, there was a race riot. 34 were killed, 675 injured, 1,893 arrested. And this resulted in part from tensions produced by the influx of black employees in the automobile and war industries and the Fair Employment Practices Commission of 41, which was designed to avoid racial discrimination in hiring. So on the one hand, you have the race riots, but on the other hand, you have a lot more black or opportunities for black employment in Detroit. Now, this puts pressure on housing. In 1940, Detroit was 9.2% black. And in 1980, 40 years later, it's 63.1%. These are statistics that I got from Joe Darden's book, Detroit, Race and Uneven Development. This was coupled with white out-migration, which is known as white flight, right? People leaving the city to go to the suburbs. So whites and blacks are living further apart than before. By 1960, even the factories and the offices of the automobile companies began to move increasingly to the suburbs. Now, this is sometimes seen as being anti-black, but Joe Darden writes that actually this isn't quite a fair assessment, because there were also more, at this time, black suburbs. And some of the factories were located either adjacent to or even in the black suburbs, allowing them to be employed in close proximity to where they lived. So the situation here is confusing. It's not straightforward. Detroit really is a super important city in the immediate aftermath of World War II because of the automobile industry, because of black employment, because of cultural production, as we'll say. So Detroit's starting to lose its prominence in the mid to late 60s. And in July of 1967, the city again erupts in a race riot with 43 deaths. But the 1960s it's a very interesting period for Detroit. And it's not easy to figure out how we should judge it, right? There's a lot going on. And part of that has to do with Fordism. Henry Ford's innovations regarding the assembly line focused less on mechanization, although it included that, of course, and more on the human element. What he was interested in, and I have a podcast episode that you should listen to about this, what he's interested in is that a worker would have only one or two tasks, and so therefore you can control the labor very strictly. There's no need for specialists or craftsmen. Most of the workers in a Ford factory would have been trained in 1 or 2 days, and you can either do the task or you weren't hired, right? And they provide relatively high wages for these jobs, and that makes the jobs in high demand. So that means that you can control your workers more, because it didn't take very long to train you. You're trained in a day, right? And so, or two, and so therefore, if you come to work drunk, or if you're chronically late, or whatever problems you might have, it's easy for the assembly line foreman to get rid of you, because they can replace you with someone that wants that job, because they're getting paid relatively high wages for the low level of work, right? So you always knew you were expendable. This is a rational and a flexible model suited to mass production, and we'll see that it has a great deal of influence on Berry Gordy. Beginning around 1963, black artists began having an increasing impact on the mainstream pop charts. Indeed, and this was the date we were looking for in the last session, crossover is so common that between December of 63 and January 65, so for all of 1964, Billboard stops tracking R&B separately. There's a pop chart and a country chart, basically, right? Because pop music is thought of as being so infiltrated or so inspired by R&B that there's no real distinction. And here you can see a Billboard chart from 1965 when we return to a distinction between R&B and pop. So there's Berry Gordy Jr., right? He opens a record store, but had little success. And you'll hear more about him in the podcast episode and the family that he came from. He came from a very business-oriented family, a family that was very interested in the ideals of Booker T. Washington. Right, and you'll hear about that in the episode. He then started writing songs for singer Jackie Wilson, including Reet Petite, which was a fairly big hit for him. But then the big hits, Lonely Teardrops, an R&B #1 and a pop #7 in 1958, and That's Why I Love You So, an R&B #2 and a pop 13 in 59. He found he wasn't making that much money on the royalties, and so after discussing the situation with Smokey Robinson, he decided he'd profit more if he was involved in all levels of production. That's part of the Fordist model. It's a vertically oriented, integrated. There you go. Integration, right? Vertically integrated business model, where what Ford does is, other than the raw materials, they try to make everything more or less in-house. Not all in the same factory, but all owned by Ford, by the Ford company, so that the lug nuts that are being used, obviously they are not making the steel, but they are making the lug nuts. They are making the engine parts. They're doing all the things. They have their own advertising, their own stores that they're selling their cars out of. All of that is vertically integrated. And Berry Gordy wants to do something similar with music. So you have Hitsville, USA. In 1959, Gordy forms Tamla Records with a loan from his family, right? I talk about that more in the podcast episode. And he has his first hit with Money, That's What I Want by Barrett Strong. And this is on the Anna label, which is named for his sister. Gordy used many different label names at first, and then he decided that his main label should be Motown, with Hitsville, USA appearing on the labels and on the studio at 2648 West Grand Boulevard, and that's what you see behind him. He's holding up a Supremes record, and behind him is the offices, and the studio is in the basement of the offices. And this is the Fordist model of song production. He worked for a time in a Ford factory, and he was inspired by the production model. In a 1990 Rolling Stone interview, he muses on the notion of applying Fordism to the creation of music and music stars. He says, quote, "It was just an idea of coming in one door and having all the things done. You know, the writing, the producing, the artist development. That's the grooming of the act, how to talk, how to speak, how to walk, choreography, all that stuff. And when you got through and you came out the door, you were like a star, a potential star. It was just that assembly line approach to things." So he models his songs on other successful records. So the Barvalettes' Please Mr. Postman, which was a pop #1 and an R&B #1 in 61. That was modeled on the Brill Building girl group song by the Contours, Do You Love Me? I'm sorry, by the Brill Building girl groups. While the Contours, his song, his group, the Contours, Do You Love Me, pop 3 and R&B #1 in 62, that was modeled on the Isley Brothers. His songs explicitly tried to appeal to white teens, and therefore it really is about assimilation, right, in some ways. But notice that his idea of assimilation isn't unidirectional. It's not just the idea of black people accommodating themselves to white people, but he's trying to draw in the white youth market into black sounds. Now, this is somewhat controversial. You'll have to decide for yourself to some extent how black the sounds of Motown are. Some people feel very strongly that the Funk Brothers are bringing in a real black aesthetic. Other people feel like they're accommodating too much to white taste. And this is something for you to decide as you're listening to this music. Moreover, once a songwriting and producing team had a hit with a group, they would continue writing for that group until they failed to produce a hit, and then another team gets a shot. So, for instance, Holland, Dozier, and Holland, who make the Supremes a success, they more or less keep the Supremes, right? They're allowed to keep writing songs for the Supremes until they fail to try to hit, and then someone else would get a shot. This leads to a great deal of strong competition and a kind of protective attitude for some of the songwriters. Gordy and his team tried to capitalize fully on their former hits. This is another way in which they're following the Fordist model. So they would cannibalize previous songs for turns of phrase, accompaniments, and melodic lines, right? Cannibalizing means you take it apart. You take parts of it. So if a particular, and this is very true of Holland, Dozier, Holland, if a particular rhythmic figure, dup, ba, like Heat Wave, right? Dup, ba, dup, that caught on. They thought that maybe that was the thing that really got people's attention. So they used it in other songs like Quicksand, which has that same ba rhythm. And you could track it in their career that for a few months they were using that rhythm. Then they move on to a different rhythm and so on. And they'll have several songs with the same rhythm. So hits are followed by similar songs. Martha and the Vandellas' Heat Wave is followed by Quicksand, right? So all these sort of natural disasters, or situations at least. The Supremes' Where Did Our Love Go? Which repeats baby, 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 where did our love go? Is followed by the song Baby Love, right? So this emphasis on the term baby, a similar feel, similar subject matter. When a formula gets stale, then you move on to another. But the idea is to cultivate formulas, things that will work, things that can be marketed. Then you have artist development and choreography, which you already heard in the interview him talking about, right? This was the first stop for a new artist, and this is where you go before you set out on the road shows. And here you can see a poster for one of the road shows, the Motown Review, right? And you can see on this one, Marvin Gaye, the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, the Marvelettes, they're all featured, the Miracles. That started in 1960, but it reaches its kind of classic status by 62. They performed on the Chitlin circuit, which was basically the African American theater circuit, right? A relatively informal collection of theaters catering to black performers that developed out of the Theater Owners Booking Association, TOBA, which we talked about last semester, and similar organizations. And in the artist development, you have the two major figures are Powell and Atkins, right? So the artists had to project a certain sophistication. They're trained how to act during interviews, how to dress on and off stage, how to walk into rooms, how to introduce themselves, how to dance with increasingly complex and individualized choreography. The choreographer is Charlie Atkins, and there you can see him working with the Temptations in the bottom picture. That's him all the way to the left. And then Maxine Powell, who had her own charm school already, is brought into the Motown crew, and you can see her up above. She's the one teaching them how to comport themselves, how to behave. Then you have the various songwriters and producers, right? We start, of course, with Smokey Robinson, because that was really how Berry Gordy got his start. William Mickey Stevenson and William Smokey Robinson, along with Berry Gordy, are the main producers at first and songwriters. Their first reliably successful group was Robinson's own group, The Miracles. And Robinson is the lead vocalist. And they had hits like Shop Around in 1960, which was a pop number 2 and an R&B number 1. Robinson's songs tended to be hopeful, and they emphasized the sweetness of love, right? My Girl, which was done by the Temptations. And they employ poetic devices like parallel contrast. You've really got a hold on me is a good example, with these extended similes and metaphors. The way you do the things you do is a good example of metaphors. So, he likes things like you're so bright, you're like a candle. I don't remember the exact line. You can look them up. But comparing the girl to a candle, the perfume, and so on, right? So these extended similes. Then we have Holland, Dozier, and Holland. From 64 to 67, they really dominate that period of Motown. Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Eddie Holland. They had a string of hits with the Supremes, Four Tops, Martha and the Vandellas. Their songs focus on the more troubling side of love. It's less hopeful than Smokey Robinson, emphasizing exposure and the possibility of loneliness. So Where Did Our Love Go? Standing in the Shadows of Love, as well as a state of dependence on the beloved. So Baby, I Need Your Loving, Baby Love, You Keep Me Hanging On, the sense of dependence. Their lyrics often include a repeated hook line, such as Baby Love, which is repeated over and over again, or Nowhere to Run, again, repeated over and over again. Their melodies often contrast a relatively complex verse melody, which is more or less in a pop style, a timpanelli style, kind of sophisticated one usually, with a simpler, catchier chorus melody, which is usually pentatonic and sometimes includes blues inflections. Nowhere to Run is the great example of this, right? They also employ a surprising number of stepwise chord progressions, so 2, 3, 4, 5, just going in stepwise motion in Heatwave, for instance. Then later we have Norman Whitfield and Ashford and Simpson. Starting around 1967, Whitfield becomes one of the major producers in Motown. He has hits with the Temptations, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Gladys Knight, and I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And then Valerie Ashford and Nick Simpson, another married songwriting team, they have a bunch of hits with duets, the duets of Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, Ain't Nothing But the Real Thing, and so on. The studio, as I mentioned, is in the basement of 2648 West Grand Boulevard. It's known as Hitsville, USA. And here you can see the mixing board, two different pictures of the mixing board, and the reel-to-reel. And then you can see the drums set up and so on the mics. They're kind of fuzzy pictures, but you get a sense of it. Of course, Motown has a studio band, just like Phil Spector had the Wrecking Crew. For Motown, it's the Funk Brothers. Most of these musicians came from the jazz scene, and they saw this really as a sort of day gig. Many of them saw it as kind of selling out. You know, they were much less interested in this music than in the jazz that they were doing, but they drew on it all the time, right? So some of the songs they would draw on the chord progression or the use of major seventh chords in Canadian Sunset, which was a jazz standard that was popular at the time. They usually worked from mere instructions. They didn't have parts written out. In fact, James Jamerson, the famous bass player, he kind of got offended later on in the later part of the 60s when Norman Whitfield would start writing out parts for him. He's like, I don't, just tell me what the chords are. I'm going to come up with my own bass line. But Norman Whitfield would insist, right? And that led to some arguments. Sometimes they only had a vague sense of the chord progression even. So early on, at least, the Funk Brothers had a great deal of agency in how these songs were put together. The leader was Joe Hunter. Then you had the pianist Earl Van Dyke, who becomes sort of the leader later. You have the drummers Benny Benjamin, the great Benny Benjamin, unfortunately somewhat unreliable, but a great drummer, and Richard Allen. The bass player, and you can see him there with his electric bass, James Jamerson. He would sometimes overdub the bass so that there was both an acoustic and a electric bass on a lot of these recordings. That's part of the distinctive sound. He was thought of as being so central to Motown that when they started moving to 16 tracks, he had a track all to himself, right? And then you have the guitarists, Robert White, Eddie Willis, and Joe Messina. And the way they would work together is they would create these informal arrangements where basically one of them would have the lower part of the guitar, one would have the middle, one would have the high part. And they would sort of improvise their way around an arrangement that way. Now, the Funk Brothers, they have more number one hits than the Beatles, Elvis Presley, the Rolling Stones, and the Beach Boys combined, right? So that's a lot of number one hits. And yet, for most of their career, they didn't get any kind of credit on the records themselves, right? The singer got the credit, the songwriters got the credit, the producers got the credit. They weren't listed on the records. Now, this shouldn't surprise you in a way. I mean, there's only so much room for that. But later, even on the albums, they didn't. It wasn't until Marvin Gaye's What's Going On that they got credit in the way that they felt they deserved. They employ much more syncopation than was typical of pop hits previously, even if it seems mild in comparison to Latin music or jazz of the time or pop now. And so this is part of that controversy as to just how black were these recordings. They felt, and many people feel, that when you listen to what they were doing with the syncopation, with the arrangements and so on, that the direction of assimilation is drawing white people toward black music rather than accommodating white tastes. There's clearly an element of both here, but it's not unidirectional. So, for example, listen to the opening bass pedal of You Can't Hurry Love, right? With that syncopation from 1966. Jamerson added pretty funky bass lines to a lot of things and sometimes doubled the acoustic and the electric. Benny Benjamin developed the Motown beat, which included a snare hit on all four beats, not just 2 and 4, so this really driving rhythm. And then you can hear some interesting innovations like the use of snow chains, snow tire chains on Martha and the Vandellas' Nowhere to Run, a custom oscillator to create synth sounds on the Supremes' Reflections, smacking 2x4s together to get that really heavy beat on Baby Love, and then you also have the tap dancing on Where Did Our Love Go and Baby Love. The tire iron on the Vandellas dancing in the street. So listen to the percussion. Obviously the clapping throughout, and in the stereo recordings you often hear the clapping and the tap dancing, for instance, on Baby Love, panning between the two the two speakers. So listen carefully to some of these songs to get a sense of the aesthetic. Then you had, as part of this Ford assembly line, you had quality control. That's sort of the end of the line. And quality control, that's exactly what you had in the Fordist model. Here in Motown, it's headed up by Billie Jean Brown, and that's who you see there. It was a board of people that judged a song before it was released. What they did is they decided which songs were ready to go to the Friday evaluation meetings every week while they were working. On Friday nights, you would have an evaluation meeting with Berry Gordy at the head of the table, and then all the producers and some of the artists around, and they would decide what was going to go out. And Billie Jean Brown had quite a bit of power because she decided what was going to go to that meeting, so she pre-filtered. Sometimes competing versions of the same song were submitted, and only one would get released. Right? Actually, a surprisingly small percentage of the recordings that made it to that meeting were actually released as singles. Some appeared later on albums, and some were dropped and reworked altogether. So if a song seemed like, even though you already put a good deal of money and production into this song, they might decide, well, this song's not ready to go out, or maybe we should re-record it or rethink the whole thing, right? So there are albums that have been collections that have been released now where you can hear things that came out of the Motown vault, and some of them are amazing, but they just didn't get released for all sorts of different reasons. Now, we already talked about some of the artists. Let's go over some of them again. Smokey, and look at some others. Smokey Robinson and the Miracles were the first big artists for Motown, and here you can see one of their advertising photographs, their promotion photographs. They had a hit with Shop Around in 1960, a Pop 2 R&B number 1. It was Motown's first million seller. They produced 26 top 40 hits during the 60s, including You've Really Got a Hold of Me, the track of my Tears, I Second That Emotion, Tears of a Clown, right? So some of these are sentimental songs, of course, and then a lot of them are like You Really Got a Hold of Me, these sort of hopeful love songs. Then you have Martha and the Vandellas with Heat Wave in 63, which was a Pop 4 R&B number 1. They followed that up with Dancing in the Streets, a Pop 2 in 64, and then Nowhere to Run, which even though it's only a Pop 8 and an R&B number 5, I think it's their best song by far. The other songs are great, but that one, there's something magical about that song. Listen carefully to the structure of it, the sound of it. Of course, the Supremes, and I talk quite a bit about the Supremes in one of the podcast episodes that you can listen to. It's the optional one for today, for today's session, but try to get around to listening to it. They started off as the Primates in 1959 as a counterpart to the Primes, which was the first version of the Temptations. And their classic lineup is Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard. They were a flop at first until Holland Dozier Holland comes along with Where Did Our Love Go? And I talk about that song a bit in the podcast episode. That became their first number 1 hit. And then they had 5 number 1 hits in a row with Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, Back in My Arms Again, right? So just this string of number 1 hits. And when they fail to chart a hit, when they have one that doesn't go, Berry Gordy gets quite mad, even though it's like, I think it's a Pop 7 or something. He gets quite mad, and I talk about this in the podcast episode, and insists that the Supremes should be their flagship group and that they should basically produce nothing but number 1 hits. Later hits include You Can't Hurry Love, which was the number 1 in 66. Then you have the Four Tops, Baby I Need Your Lovin' in 64, and I Can't Help Myself, a number 1 hit in 65, one of the great hits by the Four Tops. Another male group would be the Temptations. And then Smokey Robinson produces their hit My Girl, which we mentioned before, which was Pop number 1, R&B number 1 in 1965. This is just after the Billboard returns to charting pop music and R&B separately. And that actually worked out in the Temptations' favor because they come up first on the R&B charts. They start to gain traction, and then they cross over to the pop chart. And then Get Ready, of course, an R&B number 1 in 65. That's a great song, and you can hear why it didn't go as far on the pop elements. It's a little blacker than My Girl in its aesthetics. So listen to that if you're curious about that. And then, of course, Norman Whitfield begins producing them with Ain't Too Proud to Beg in 1966. To my mind, one of their great hits. It's a Pop 13 and an R&B number 1. And of course, you also have Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye, who both get their start at Motown in the early 60s. But by 68, they begin demanding more freedom, and that ultimately leads to the decline of the Motown assembly line approach to a more artist related approach, right? Now, notice that Motown's a bit different than the Brill Building. They are interested in cultivating artists. Marvin Gaye, the Temptations, they all have careers and they're all notable, the Supremes, of course. But the idea is really that the emphasis is still on the production. Holland Dozier Holland more than the Supremes. That starts to fade in the late 60s. And the late 60s see a pretty important change in Motown. Not necessarily a change for the worse, at least not at first, because the early 70s and the late 60s, early 70s, that's when you have What's Going On, Marvin Gaye gaining more independence. That's when you have Stevie Wonder renegotiating his contract, and we're going to talk about that in a later session. But of course, they also moved to LA. Motown moves its main operations to LA in 1972, and it becomes something very different. And eventually, Berry Gordy will sell it, right? It loses something in that move, even though it's gaining market share. By the end of the 60s, by the way, and I can't believe I didn't write this here, but let's say it. I say it in the podcast episodes. Motown is the biggest black industry, the biggest black business in the U.S., black-owned and run and operated, right? So it is the largest black-owned and operated business in the late 60s, early 70s in the U.S. It is the great success story as far as assimilation goes, because he is in many ways modeling his practices on previous models. He is the Booker T. Washington ideal as well, because he starts off within a black community and then moves out into a white community, providing something to the white community that doesn't have on its own. It doesn't have that Motown sound. He creates a need for it. He creates a desire for it, and then he caters to that desire that he's created. It's a huge success story. And we'll see what happens to Motown in the 70s in a later session when we talk more about Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder in the late 60s and early 70s. That's it for this session, and I will see you at the next one.